Yeah. Okay, so is it okay? You can hear me? All right. Yeah, so Tassos mentioned that this talk should be thought-provoking. So I interpreted that as being low resolution and highly speculative, all right? So to warn you. Now, when humans think about big questions regarding their existence, one thing that they'll oftentimes do is look towards the past to figure out who we are, right? There's different ways of doing that. One way is to take a more objective or scientific perspective of looking at anthropology and evolution to understand what it means to be human. Right? Another way, another approach would be to look at the stories that humans tell about ourselves, right? And this is done in myth, basically in the religious myths. So in this myth, this is the story of Cain and Abel, right? It's kind of interesting about Cain and Abel because in some ways they're like the very first, real human beings, right? In the sense that they're the first humans that were created out of the sexual union of a male and female. And they were the first humans who lived outside of the Garden of Eden in the world that we all live in, right? So this is the idea of what it means, Cain and Abel, right? And so what about Cain and Abel? What are they like? What are we like, right? If you remember the story, Cain becomes jealous of Abel, and then he slays him. And also, there's a number of interesting elements to this story, but one I'll just point your attention to is this idea of the mark of Cain, right? So God puts a mark on Cain with the idea that if anybody kills Cain, then they will have sevenfold destruction or violence onto them, right? So this idea of the mark of Cain has been interpreted as being a way in this ancient society to help prevent escalation of violence. Right? And so this idea of trying to prevent escalation of retributive violence was made a very large advance by one of the earliest law codes in the world, which is the Code of Hammurabi. Right? And so this is a famous code. The Latin is lex talionis, which is like retributive law. And the idea here, right, is that if a man destroys the eye of another man, they shall destroy his eye, right? So it's the eye for an eye. But what people oftentimes interpret that as being is that it's a very punitive law, right? If you do something bad, you're going to get it. But the scholars of ancient Near East say that that's the incorrect interpretation. Actually, what this is about is a restrictive law, right? So if you take somebody's eye out, the most you can do is take out the perpetrator's eye, right? So it's to restrict, to again prevent retributive endless cycle of violence. So that was one advance of the Hammurabi law. A second advance is that they took the justice out of the hands of the individuals, the victims and their families, and put it into the hands of an impartial state, right? So it made important advances, right? So this idea, this problem of retributive violence is actually, even though this law was made in 1700 BCE, it's still a problem. You can't see this here, but as I was doing some research for this talk, I learned about in Albania that there's still a huge problem with retributive violence. There are these blood feuds that go back hundreds of years, and it's with males. And so these males in the law or in the unspoken rules is that you can't kill somebody if they're in their house. So these men are stuck in their houses. So there's in Albania, then there's some famous work by Nisbet and Cohen about the culture of honor in the American South. And so all of these examples, such as the ancient Near East, Albania, the American South, the southern part of Italy in particular, these machismo cultures are the cultures of honor in which status is very important for males, and male's status is maintained by exhibiting strong violence against any kind of slights or small offenses, right? And what's interesting also is that you might imagine that there are some real terrible repercussions for social institutions when there's these cultures of violence, these cultures of revenge. Right? So if you look at the economics in the United States, the further south you go, this is where you get the retributive culture, the culture of honor, and the further south you go, you'll see more and more poverty, right? The same thing in Italy. Further south you go, more the machismo, the honor culture, and more poverty. So there's a question, well, does the poverty cause the culture of honor? Probably, right? But also there's some evidence that it goes the opposite way, which also would make sense. And in 2011, the World Bank had a big research about this in demonstrating the inference was that when there's this culture of revenge, culture of violence, this really has a terrible impact on all sorts of social institutions, including ones having to do with economics. So there's not only societal levels of negative consequences, but there's individual levels as well. So for this, there's psychological costs for this perspective of being unable to let go of offense, right? Of being unable to forgive. So there's people will, contrary to what you might think, of getting catharsis by attacking one's perpetrator, people actually feel worse and they ruminate more. And there's some evidence accumulating, it's new research, showing that these sorts of constructs are also play a role in psychopathology like depression, PTSD, and addiction. Okay, so if revenge is bad and forgiveness is good, then what do we know about forgiveness? Well, it can be defined as a decision to give up resentment and to respond with goodwill. That is benevolence based on a desire for the ultimate welfare of the other person. Okay. Psychology researchers have been starting to look at forgiveness with some depth now for about 20 years, but it's still a relatively new topic of study. But forgiveness is not a new topic for humankind, right? So it's traditionally been addressed by religions. So across a lot of the world religions, there's moral imperatives about forgiveness. So in Christianity, it's been said, an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, right? This lex talionis. But I say to you that do not resist evil. It's been said that you should love your neighbor, hate your enemy, but I say to you, love your enemies, right? And in Islam, the repayment of a bad action is one equivalent to it. That's normative. But if someone pardons and puts things right, his reward is with Allah, right? So the forgiveness is what's more highly valued. And in Buddhism, hatred does not cease through hatred at any time. Hatred ceases through love. This is an unalterable law. Okay. So religions have had a concern, right, with the group, with the individuals in the group, and saying that forgiveness is an essential part of maintaining the group cohesion. And one way they've done that is through these moral imperatives, through these propositions. But in another way, that I'm going to try to piece out a little bit today, is through experience. Right? And religious experience of the divine or spiritual, can be thought of as being an experience that involves the emotion of awe. And awe is defined, Dr. Keltner has done as a psychologist who's done most work on this, and he did a review, psychology, philosophy, sociology, and he defines awe as involving two main parts. One is an experience of something vast, something immense, that's beyond our capacity to understand it, right? So in this Piagetian sense, right, our assimilation, our schemas do not allow us to represent, do not allow us to digest what we're experiencing. It's beyond that. And it's something that draws us forward, like we're fascinated by it. So it calls for this Piagetian accommodation, that we will change our mental structure in response to this awesome experience. Okay, and humans are really good at experiencing awe. Like, there's some evidence that chimpanzees might have some experiences of awe. It was actually quite interesting. But humans are unique in our ability to experience this emotion. The extent of it, right? So here's the universe from NASA. And it's been estimated that there's 10 to the 88th power of electrons. I mean, I don't even know, how do you even imagine that? I have no idea. I don't even know what, was it the Miller? We have like 7 bits of information, plus or minus 2, so I don't know how 10 to the 88th would apply to that, right? But it's a lot. It's beyond our imagination, but it's interesting, right? People find that interesting. Or you take a game of chess. It's been estimated by Claude Shannon that there are 10 to the 120th possible games of chess, right? So, I mean, that's like magnitudes more than the number of electrons in the universe, right? So unless you're dead, I mean, you're probably feeling a little bit of awe at that, huh? I mean, that's strange. So, okay, so humans can experience awe. I mean, that's interesting. So I looked at a couple of these early stories of the experience of awe, and there's some themes that I think are interesting and potentially very relevant for psychology research. So in one of the stories, this is from the book of Job, Job, right, was the most righteous person on earth, did nothing wrong. And then God was in heaven, and then one of God's angels came and said, he's the prosecutor angel, and he says, hey, God says, hey, look at Job, he's a pretty good guy, huh? And then the angel said, well, listen, you gave him all sorts of riches, beautiful wife, nice family. Of course he's an A1 guy and he likes you. He says, if you take these things away from Job, then Job will curse you. God says, no way. Go ahead, do your best. Job will not curse me. And then, right, this angel takes away his flocks get stolen, his wife and children get killed, he gets all these scabs on himself, and then he's really unhappy, right? And his friends come to him and say, hey, Job, what did you do wrong? Because we know that God rewards those who are good and punishes those who are bad. So you're being punished, so you did something bad. Job said, what have I done bad? And he says, and eventually he loses his patience and he says, God, come down. I want to bring you to a court of law and then make my case. I want justice here, right? Well, eventually God does come down, but they don't go to the court of law. Instead, God gives Job an awesome experience, an experience of the universe, right, of all creation. And at the end of that, Job is reconciled, right? And he's okay with things. And, interesting kind of quote of the story is that God says, yeah, your friends who said that, if you're good, you're rewarded, if you're bad, you're punished, they're wrong. I'm going to kill them. And then Job says, well, don't do that. And then God says, okay. So this idea, right, of rational justice was incorrect, and Job had this experience that allowed him to transcend that. And then in the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna, main character, he's supposed to go into battle. But he knows that his army, who are his kin, is related to them, most of them will die. He says, no way, I'm not going to do this. This is wrong. Then Krishna comes down and similarly gives Arjuna an experience of creation of the universe. And then at the end of that, Krishna says, okay, I go into battle. And something I found that's very interesting there in both of these stories is that the protagonists wanted a rational universe. They wanted justice. And then they got an experience of awe, and it allowed them to be reconciled to the world. Like they had a bigger frame of reference that could include the good and the bad. And then they were okay at a deep existential level. So, the rationale then might have something to do with forgiveness. So this idea is that you can move from justice to acceptance. Well, there's a guy, William Cantwell Smith, he's a philosopher. He says that the core of religion is love trumps justice, right? So moving from this rational need for justice to broader acceptance might be useful, or having the self as a part of a greater whole. Like there's some research on that by Shiota et al. Or an expanded perception of time gives you a bigger perspective of what's important, and that can guide your behavior, or it can perhaps even help people get to a more humble state, right? That there's less of a need for me. You have to treat me well, right? So we looked at this question then of whether awe would be related to forgiveness in 3 studies. So in the first study, we had 65 people from the community come in, and then this is just cross-sectional. They reported they had measures of dispositional awe, like I often feel awe. We also looked at another positive affect sort of measure, meaning, to see if it was especially about awe in particular, or just about this kind of positive affective sort of experience, such as like understand my life's meaning. Then we also included a measure of time perspective, a consideration of future consequences, with items such as, I'm willing to sacrifice my immediate happiness or well-being in order to achieve future outcomes. And then we give a measure of general forgiveness. Just, are you the type of person who will forgive people, right? I continue to punish a person who has done something that I think is wrong, right? That's non-forgiving. And the results showed, so here's dispositional awe, and here's general forgiveness disposition. There's a significant correlation, medium effect size. And then also when we controlled for amount of meaning that people experienced in their life, that continued to be a positive relation between awe and forgiveness. And we also looked at the time perspective and found that there was a partial mediation of the relation between awe and forgiveness. So the direct effect was no longer significant, and there was an indirect effect between awe for the relation with future-orientedness, as accounting for some of the reason why people who experience more awe are more likely to forgive. Okay. So in the second study, also a correlational study, we kind of replicated this, but we did two small different things. One is that we gave a different measure of positive affect. And then the second thing is that we actually asked them not about your general disposition to forgive, but forgiveness for a particular transgressor. Because there's been some research showing that people who are religious or spiritual, they show strong correlations between their spirituality or their religiousness and general forgiveness, but it shows a null relation with when you ask them to actually, do you forgive this particular person, right? So then this general forgiveness could be more about the ideal that they have or how they should be. So in this study, students, they completed a dispositional awe measure, a measure of positive affect from the PANIS. I often feel inspired, enthusiastic, and so on. And then we looked at a transgression specific forgiveness. So we had participants recall the particular person that was most cruel to them in their life, the most traumatic situation where somebody was wronged you, right? So they recalled that, wrote about that a little bit. And then we gave them a measure of forgiveness of that particular person. And we found is that people who higher in dispositional awe were more likely to show forgiveness of that particular person. Again, a medium effect size. And also this remained when you controlled for general positive affect. Okay. Okay, and then we brought this into the lab in an experimental setting in study 3. So here we had participants, undergraduates. We had them, again, write about a specific person, the person who most wronged them in their past. They did this for 5 minutes. Then they were randomly assigned to one of 3 conditions. High-intensity awe condition, in which they watched a video of the universe. There's Carl Sagan, he's the astronomer, right? And he was working with NASA in the 1980s when they had one of these Voyager satellites go out. And then when it was really far out, he suggested to them, turn it around and take a picture of the Earth, right? And they did. They took a picture of the Earth, and then it looks like a pale blue dot, right? And it's really cool because you see this big darkness, and then you see this line. It's the sunshine, right? We think the sunshine is so huge, but it's just this little line. And then you see the pale blue dot within that sunshine. And then he wrote a book called The Pale Blue Dot. And there's a really nice segment from that book about the Earth and its position in this vast universe. So some clever primate put that to video and has this wonderful music on it. And so it's really very moving, right? So we had participants watch that. Or we had a low awe condition in which they heard Carl Sagan's his vignette that he was reading, but there's no video, no music. And then we had a humor condition. So you can't really see this, but this is for the BBC Talking Animals. And if you've seen it, right, there's this groundhog. He goes, Alan, Alan, Alan. If you've seen it, you will know it because it's really funny. And if you haven't seen it, you should watch it. So then we had them go in one of these 3 conditions. Then we had them rate their state affect, positive, how much positive emotion now, how much negative emotion after the film, and how much awe did you experience while you watched that film. And then we had them report on the forgiveness of that transgressor that they wrote about earlier on. And the results showed this. So here's forgiveness, here's the humor, low awe, high awe. So there was a significant difference between the high awe group and the humor group, right? So there was more forgiveness, even in comparison with another positive emotion induction. Here you can't really see this, but here's the amount of awe that they experienced in the film, and it goes stepwise. So the high awe had significantly more than the low awe. The low awe experienced more awe than the humor group. And the last thing, here's the affect. For positive affect, there's no difference between humor and high awe, but the humor had more positive affect than the low awe. And here's the state negative affect. So the humor had less negative affect than both the low awe and the high awe group, right? So the humor had the least negative affect. All right, so then we looked at mediation too, to see whether or not this relation, that forgiveness of the total forgiveness score, high awe, had more forgiveness than the humor group. It also had more experience of awe in the video. We're going to see where this would partially mediate the effects that are going on there. So we looked at the condition, humor versus high awe, forgiveness, and how much awe they experienced in the film. And there was a partial mediation, right? So the direct effect was no longer significant, and the indirect effect was significant, right? So this suggests that the reason why that awe-inspiring video group, why they were more willing to forgive the transgressor, was because they actually experienced awe. Now, there was a difference in awe here too, right? The low awe had more than the humor, high awe had more than the low awe. So we just did some exploratory mediation analyses and found that when you compare the humor versus low awe, that there was an indirect effect of how much awe they experienced in the film on forgiveness, right? Even though there's no direct effect here, there was an indirect effect. And the same sort of thing happened here. The low awe versus high awe, no direct effect here, but there was an indirect effect. So again, suggesting that the experience of awe can be useful in enhancing forgiveness of transgressors. Okay, so that's the main part. The last speculative part is you may or may not be aware of, there's like this line of research and thinking now about religion in sociality. So there's a very well done book by Nouriazanian called Big Gods. And then in Nature, last 2 months ago, there's a very nice paper that came out by Joel Heinrich and his group about moralistic gods, supernatural punishment, and expansion of human sociality. So the ideas here in this perspective is that, you know, the humans went from small groups to larger groups. And this has been like really essential for the development of human culture and civilization. And this perspective is that part of the reason that that could happen is the existence of typically monotheistic religions that had a very punishing God, right? And so Heinrich did some nice research here where he demonstrates that when there is when there is existence of a punishing God, that people are more likely to expand their social network to other people who are co-religionists. It's very interesting work. But these data, I would suggest, as a whisper of speculation that I just presented, might also have another angle to this, right? That is not only the fear of punishment of the divine that might lead to more poor sociality, but the experience of the immense that religions can help to facilitate might also lead to more forgiveness and thus more group cohesions in bigger groups. Okay, so in conclusion, if I have not convinced you of the importance of forgiveness in and of itself, I would ask you then to at least take the advice of Oscar Wilde, who says, always forgive your enemies. Nothing annoys them so much. Thank you.